thankful to Professor Boaz Hirsch who invited me to take part in this conference. And thank you very much, Walter, for the inspiring talk earlier. I'm happy to get the chance to share with you several insights and ideas that have kept me busy for quite some time. Before I begin this short talk, I must confess that I would not define it as an orderly lecture, but rather as a mutual brainstorming procedure or opportunity. The fact is that the names of Oliphant, Balfour, and Wingate keep knocking on some imaginary doors in the back of my mind on a regular basis, again and again, calling me to open up these doors, let them in, and finally do something about them, in order to relieve them from some of the misperceptions, the misinterpretations, and even the loss of interest in their lives, which is usually the fate of those who were unwillingly adopted by a certain establishment, either political or academic, which uses the life stories to fit a larger mythical story in which they originally played a certain part. Such is the case with these three British gentlemen who contributed to the Zionist project throughout several crucial decades, from the 1870s to the 1930s. The Zionist-oriented historiography tends to cherish their names and contributions, but only up to a certain point. Whatever lies beyond that point, in this case, their odd interest in spiritualism and or in Christian fundamentalism, was usually kept aside, unattended, forgotten, and even, if I may, deliberately untouched. The number of the academic literature that deal with their spiritualism is relatively small, and the official treatment of their memory in Israel in regard to educational programs in schools or universities is still the same for many years. It all sums up to a certain given equation. Oliphant, Balfour, and Wingate came to a point in their lives, each one individually, with no connection between them, none whatsoever, in which they decided to help the Zionist project. We were lucky to have them. And in the same time, they were right to do what they did. The fact that all three did what they did without any visible logical motive doesn't seem to bother anyone. The fact that, on the contrary, at least in the cases of Balfour and Wingate, they did what they did in spite of any logical motive, remains somewhat obscure. We all know that the Balfour Declaration of 2nd of November 1917 had caused a severe headache to the British Empire for many years to come. We know for certain what happened to old Wingate, whose enthusiastic pro-Zionist activity costed him his post and made his commanders send him back to England against his will. All the same, no one seems to be bothered by the fact that in parallel to this mythical set of educational messages, the British government in general is presented before Jewish students in schools and university with the most negative sentiments. When I went to school, I was told that Balfour and Wingate were the good guys. No one seemed to care that much about Oliphant back then. But that, on the other hand, the government was bad, hypocritical and disastrous for the Zionist project. How can this be? I keep asking myself, how can the foreign minister, Balfour, be so good while at the same time the country he served became so quickly the worst villain in the Zionist story? I will try, therefore, to outline several answers or solutions to these dissonances. I will emphasize the interest all three had in spiritualism and religion as my main argument. I do not claim that this is the only viable way to understand all three's actions. Naturally, understanding the whole story demands a larger spectrum explanation that involves several disciplines, that of political history, economical history, or military history, to number just the obvious. Nonetheless, I do believe that the spiritual explanation will indeed enrich the common Zionist narrative with aspects that are usually ignored by the academic establishment. So there, I still have to bring my confession to a certain closure. These imaginary brain doors of mine are not widely open yet, due to the regular excuse, work, and work. Now, seriously, during the past 10 years, I've decided to dedicate myself to the study of Western esotericism, and particularly to the study of Theosophy and its offspring movements. There was just no room for British gentlemen whose actions became crucial to the history of Zionism. You must be aware of that ill 21st century syndrome. Academics in general, and historians in particular, are expected to narrow their field of research to a certain line. One is not supposed to deal with the Theosophical Mahatmas and with Zionism at the same time. So please, don't tell anyone about this lecture. Let's keep it between us for the time being. And who knows, perhaps if these imaginary brain doors will somehow be widely open in the future, I might even consider to do something about it. For now, let me just tell you a story, and I hope this story will be an interesting one. The life story of Lawrence Oliphant, born in 1829, he died in 1888, offers a fine example to a certain model, that of the modern Christian Zionist millenarianist. Motivated by a biblical messianic faith and the belief that the Jewish rule in the land of Israel was a necessary stage in the preparation of the way for the return of Christ, Christians have been at time more enthusiastic than Jews over the prospect of a Jewish state. English and American Protestant Messianic churches preceded the Zionist movement in proclaiming the return of the Jews to Palestine. For example, Theodor Herzl's advisor, William Heschler, was one of those. He was the one who introduced Herzl to the Duke of Baden, who in his turn introduced Herzl to the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. In Yaakov Ariel words, one could determine that through the 19th century, the only times that Zionism came close to achieving success were on occasions when all three elements, Jewish nationalism, great power, strategic interest, and evangelical millenarianism, were involved. Oliphant was an evangelical millenarianist Christian by birth, who from 1878 until his death dedicated himself to the promotion of the foundation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Besides spending several years in Palestine, Oliphant participated in the Volksschan Zionist Congress of Chovevei Zion in Romania in 1882, where he gave a speech and encouraged the participants to align forces and to send Jewish immigrants to Palestine. He was truly admired by Romanian Jews who nicknamed him the second Koresh, the second Cyrus. His plan, which included the obtainment of a charter on Palestine from the Turkish Sultan and the foundation of an autonomous Jewish society in it, preceded Theodor Herzl's exact plan in some 15 years or so. Oliphant's family was from Scottish middle class. His father was a diplomat who served in several countries in Europe and the Far East. Young Lawrence never graduated a regular school, but did get the chance to observe, experience, and assimilate foreign cultures, languages, and landscapes. Perhaps this is what contributed to his lust for travel to distant places, which was first evidenced in his book, The Russian Shores of the Black Sea, based on his travels in Russia in 1852. This book became a crucial source of intelligence for the English army in its preparation for the Crimean War in 1854, being the only existing documentation of Russia's less explored parts, and thus paved the way for Oliphant's diplomatic career. Between 1854 to 1864, he was appointed to several missions in China, Japan, and Europe, some of which were of secretive character. During this time, he became familiar with several major European and English leaders. Among those were the Prince of Wales, who became his intimate friend, and the influential politician Benjamin Disraeli, England's well-known Prime Minister. Oliphant was elected to the House of Commons in 1865 as a Liberal, and instantly became a successful author with his anonymously published satire Piccadilly. However, these golden days were rather short. Oliphant was probably not built for a political career. Already in 1866, just a few months after his election to Parliament, he felt that the choice he's made was a disaster. A change was needed, and indeed his life was dramatically changed after having met the American poet and mystic Thomas Lake Harris. Harris was influenced by Emanuel Swedenborg's doctrines. He preached that God was essentially bisexual. Thus, one of his main ideas was that every person would find the reflection of God in a soulmate of the opposite sex. He dealt with spiritualism, which became quite fashionable in America since 1848, beginning with the phenomena of the Fox sisters, and accordingly, soulmate was a spirit he called the Lily Queen, which was manifested in the body of several of his female disciples. Harris traveled to London in 1859, where he stayed for some time, gathering a remarkable group of admirers around him. Later, he returned to America, where he established a religious community in upstate New York, which he named the Brotherhood of the New Life. There were about 60 members in that commune who lived and worked for no personal profit. Oliphant met Harris in London in 1859 and visited him in America in 1865. Then he returned to England for his election campaign. However, in 1867, when Harris revisited England, Oliphant was already in a quite different state of mind. Disappointed by his unsuccessful short political career, he decided to join Harris on his trip back to America and join the Brotherhood of the New Life, where he was nicknamed Woodbine. He lived there, was already in Brockton, the state of New York, for several months, during which he practiced the Brotherhood's disciplines. These involved hard physical labor and celibacy. Nonetheless, Harris invented a special practice, which could have been nowadays easily mistaken for tantric yoga, which he called breathing together. This involved a so-called meditative exercise in which mixed couples, and never married couples, were breathing in each other's arms in order to reach spiritual sexual ecstasy and to find a true soulmate. Naturally, Harris had the authority to select a soulmate for each individual participating in these practices. Oliphant lived under Harris's spiritual direction at least until 1878. He publicly disengaged himself from Harris's teachings in 1881. During that period, in 1872, he met in Paris his future wife, Alice Lestrange, who would soon marry him. She is 26, and according to my taste, very pretty. But that has nothing with it, he wrote to a friend in March that year. However, Harris had to agree to the marriage, and so he did, after having Oliphant promise him that his new wife would join the Brotherhood of the New Life in Brockton, New York. Alice was to stay with the Brotherhood until 1880, and even moved with Harris to his new community in California, where Harris selected her as the new vehicle to embody his soulmate, the Lily Queen. In the meanwhile, Oliphant was busy with other plans. The most notable of those was his plan to be appointed as the president of the Council of Hyderabad, one of India's rich princely states. Hyderabad enjoyed a reasonable amount of independence under the British rule, but its Muslim leaders craved for more. According to the Earl of Lytton, the British Viceroy of India at that time, Oliphant was a part of a conspiracy against the British Raj. Lytton's hostility may have been out of proportion. Nonetheless, he decided to ban Oliphant from India and credited him a born intriguer. Could it be that Lytton disliked Oliphant's connections with Thomas Lake Harris? One may wonder if that was indeed the case. However, it is worth noticing that Lytton himself had some peculiar biographical connections with the occult. His father was the famous author and statesman Edward Bulwer Lytton, who was the author of Zanoni and The Coming Grace, two of the more intriguing esoteric novels of the 19th century. Bulwer Lytton kept close connections with the Christian Kabbalist Eliphaz Levi. His daughter, Emily, who would become the wife of the famous architect Edwin Lutyens, was a prominent theosophist who would in the future serve as Krishnamurti's patroness and hostess in London for many years. This way or the other, after the failure of his Indian adventure, Oliphant was in urgent need for another field of action. This is when his interest in Palestine was invoked in 1878, as is evidenced in a letter he wrote to a friend of his from London. Let me just grab my bag, because the book I'm about to read from is right here. And I will just quote a few lines from a letter he wrote in 1878 to his English friend, and I quote, "My Eastern project is as follows: to obtain a concession from the Turkish government in the northern and more fertile half of Palestine, which the recent survey of Palestine, of the Palestine Exploration Fund, proves to be capable of immense development. Any amount of money can be raised upon it, owing, pay attention to that, to the belief which people have that there would be fulfilling prophecy and bringing on the end of the world." I don't know why they are so anxious for this latter event, but it makes this commercial speculation easy, as it is a combination of the financial and sentimental elements which will, I think, ensure success. And it will be a good political move for the government, as the British government naturally, as it will enable them to carry out reforms in Asiatic Turkey, provide money for the port, and by uniting the French in it, and possibly the Italians, be a powerful religious move against the Russians, who are trying to obtain a hold of the country of Palestine, but they're pilgrims. It would also secure the government a large religious support in this country, in England, as even the radicals would waive their political in favor of their religious crutches. I also anticipate a very good subscription in America. I shall probably start about the end of the year for Egypt, as I want to look into the working of the mixed jurisdiction, and then go to Cyprus, Syria, Palestine, and Constantinople. I suppose I shall find plenty to write about, but I do not want it all talked of, though I find it difficult to keep it quiet. Both Lord Beaconsfield, Benjamin Disraeli, and Lord Salisbury are very favorable to my scheme. In 1880, Ellis Lestrange, Ellis Oliphant already, in 1880, joined him in London. A year later, Oliphant traveled to America, where he finally broke with Thomas Lake Harris, managing to obtain a sum of some 100,000 American dollars from him, alongside several members of the Brotherhood of the New Life, who followed Oliphant to Palestine in 1882. He stayed in Palestine until 1886, spending the winters in Haifa and the hot summers in the Druze village of Daliat el-Carmel. All in all, the Oliphants seem to have finally conducted a relatively happy life in Palestine, mingling with the locals, traveling around, and hosting guests. One of these was General Gordon, who visited them in Haifa in 1884, shortly before his departure to his last campaign in Sudan. This all ended with the death of Ellis in 1886. Lawrence Oliphant was broken-hearted, but still convinced with a spiritualistic idea of life after death, decided to write his Scientific Religion, a book in which he describes his mystical views on human existence. In 1887, he traveled back to England and later that year to America. Shortly after, he married Rosamund, Robert Owen's granddaughter, and in December 1888, he died in England, never to see his visions come true. Was Oliphant a true seeker after the occult? Was he just another Christian fundamentalist? Was he, after all, a devoted disciple of Thomas Lake Harris, or perhaps was he the combination of all three elements? Allow me to quote just another quotation from Oliphant's own words in a short letter he wrote in October 1884, in which he describes his disapproval of Alfred Sinnett's book Esoteric Buddhism, which was published in 1883. Sinnett was a devoted theosophist and one of Madame Blavatsky's closest disciples. His book created quite a severe interest in theosophy in England, and hence Oliphant's arguments against it. Please pay attention to the fact that despite his criticism of theosophy, Oliphant defines his own spiritualist views in a manner that is not necessarily that remote from the theosophical teachings, which he objects. This was written from Haifa in 1884 to a friend of his, Miss Hamilton. You're not the only one of my friends who, who has been fascinated by esoteric Buddhism. Indeed, one of them is going out to India to become a Mahatma himself, if he can. When the Theosophical Society was first founded by Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Orcutt, both of whom I know, and others, I was asked to become a member of it. But I had reasons at the time, which I have since found to be sound, which prevented me from identifying myself with it in any way. I believe the whole thing to be a delusion and a snare. Just a few more words from the same letter. What we are seeking for is a force which shall enable us to embody in daily life such simple ethics as those of Christ, which were based on altruism, and which no one, after 1800 years of effort, has succeeded in doing, for want of adequate spiritual potency. If some of us, myself included, have came into an abnormal physical condition, it wasn't with the view of finding out occult mysteries about the cosmogony of the world, but of seeking to discover a force which one could bring down and apply to the physical needs of this one. It was in this effort I found that trance and abnormal physical conditions were unreliable, though I'm far from saying that the experiences gained through them may not be turned to good account, or that certain truths even may not be acquired. But unless these truths are afterwards susceptible of verification while in full possession of all our natural faculties, they should not be received or acted upon as truths. So this will give us at least a slight clue as to Oliphant's views about spiritualism. Now, let us shortly delve ourselves in the story of another British statesman, Arthur James Balfour, born in 1848, died in 1930. who served as Prime Minister from 1902 to 1905 and later as Foreign Secretary from 1916 to 1919, during which he initiated his famous declaration stating that the British government would do whatever in its power to assist the Zionist movement to obtain, and I quote, a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Balfour was no ordinary millenarianist nor a Christian fundamentalist. If anything, he was a devoted spiritualist who apparently believed in the other world and participated in seances for many years. Similarly, with Oliphant, his interest in Zionism began, so it seems, in a relatively late stage of his life. In 1906, he first met Dr. Chaim Weizmann in Manchester and was fascinated by the young Zionist scientist. True, even before that, he was impressed with the Zionist movement's spurn of the Uganda plan. And even before that, he was quoted as saying that the Christian religion and civilization owes to Judaism an immeasurable debt, shamefully ill repaid. Some 8 years after the first meeting, Balfour and Weizmann met again in England in December 1914. The Great War was already fought for several months, and as it seems, Weizmann succeeded in drawing Balfour's attention to the Jewish question. In Weizmann's words, Balfour said, "I am deeply moved and interested. It is not a dream. It is a great cause, and I understand it." Balfour was among the most ardent associates of the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, and participated in its conducted seances until his last day. The SPR was founded back in 1892 by a group of respected academics led by Henry Sidgwick, a philosophy professor at Cambridge University. Sidgwick was the president of the society almost continually till 1892, with the two Balfour brothers and their sister Eleanor among his most noted associates. Arthur James Balfour was the SPR's president in 1893. His younger brother Gerald was appointed president in 1906. Eleanor, the sister who was married to Sidgwick in 1876, was the society's president in the 1930s. Other presidents of the SPR included well-known figures from the contemporary spheres of science and politics, among them Andrew Lang, the mythologist, and the former Prime Minister Gladstone. The purpose of the society was the scientific examination of the spiritual phenomena which occurred in seances, and to try and determine scientifically and objectively whether the soul persisted after death. The need for such a society arose from the proliferation of spiritual movements and the almost obsessive preoccupation with the supernatural that markedly characterized the late Victorian period. During the 1880s, spiritualist interest reached tremendous flowering in England. A variety of esoteric societies mushroomed. Interested in the Kabbalah was revived, as well as in Hermetic lore and reincarnation. The number of astrologers and practitioners of palmistry increased, and books on magic and the occult were extremely popular. This great interest in the occult and spiritualism at that time is usually attributed to the Victorian crisis of faith, and the numerous individuals who engage in these subjects are commonly described as fugitives from the Christian belief. This way or the other, this was a period rife with contradictions when religion, belief in progress, and spiritualism cohabited in relative harmony. Balfour was intrigued by what he experienced during the many seances he attended. Although he always kept skepticism at hand, it is clear that some of the messages he received from the other side meant greatly to him. Such was the case with the communication he handled from 1911 till his death in 1930 with the spirit of his first love, May Littleton, who died of typhoid back in 1875. Can we draw a direct line between Balfour's spiritualism and his adoption of the Zionist dream? This needs further investigation, which I intend to conduct in the forthcoming months. Nonetheless, the fact that the man who signed the famous Balfour Declaration had a strong interest in the occult seems to me to be important enough to justify future research. The third and last protagonist of this short story is Orde Wingate, born in 1903, he died in 1944, and the founder of the Night Squads. Wingate, who was born in India and raised mostly in England as a child, received a strict religious education. His parents were devoted members of the Plymouth Brethren, a conservative, extreme evangelical Christian movement who was formed in Ireland in the 1820s and became very popular throughout the UK during the 19th century. Another famous member of it is Alistair Crowley, an ex-Plymouth Brethren member. He joined the army in 1921, and after serving in the Sudan and England, he was posted in Palestine in 1936 as an intelligence officer. From the first moment of his arrival, he devoted himself to the evangelical idea, according to which a foundation of a Jewish state was an essential step to precede the return of Christ. Soon after his arrival, he began to train Jewish fighters in guerrilla tactics and in nighttime combat. His night squads operated against Arab villagers who participated in the 1936 Arab uprising. Their actions were considered cruel and extreme in regard to the violence they involved. Eventually, this led to the dismissal of Wingate from his post and made his superiors send him back to England in 1939, since he was suspected to have promoted his own views, which are not the official views of the British Mandate government. Let me get to several short conclusions. It is perhaps interesting to know that all three gentlemen, as I briefly discussed, had strong Scottish background, not necessarily English. However, all three became deeply involved with the British Empire's policy from the late 19th century until the late 1930s. Each one had individually contributed to the formation of the State of Israel. Side by side with the pro-Zionist activities, these three were promoting ideas which the Zionist establishment usually prefers to ignore: spiritualism, Christian fundamentalism, and Christian Zionism. These ideas do not necessarily go hand in hand with Zionism, as we well know. Quite the contrary, it seems to be contradictory to the vision of the founders and leaders of the Zionist movement, who were mostly identified with values of rationalism, socialism, atheism, and a scientific approach to life in general. Perhaps it is time to widen our horizons and to understand that sometimes historical processes, crucial as they may seem, are the outcome of various factors besides the political, economical, or military factors. Understanding the spiritual motives which are embodied in the actions of Oliphant, Wingate, and Balfour may lead us to a better understanding of our own legacy and help us study and teach it in a much more reliable and objective academic atmosphere. Thank you very much.